Can you please be seated? Good afternoon. Good afternoon. As I said this morning, this afternoon, we're going to have two discussions. One discussion, the first discussion is on climate change and energy. Now, we will have four speakers to introduce the issues to you. Before they do that, I would like to make two remarks to you on the issue. First remark is that probably all of you know that climate change in the Caspian Sea region is very closely linked to a very, very old debate on sea level water fluctuation in the Caspian Sea region. That debate is not from yesterday. I mean, it dates back very long. And climate change debate cannot be seen separate from what has happened with the water level in the Caspian Sea. We will come back to that. The second issue, I think, is even more important. I don't know how many of you have seen this report. This report is the most recent summary for policymakers negotiated by all the governments of the world in South Korea in the context of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. When the Paris Summit on Climate Change took place, countries have made voluntary commitments to reduce their emission levels of CO2 to assist in curbing climate change. There was also a question in Paris to the scientists in the world, and the IPCC is consisting of about 3,000 scientists, to give an estimate of the impact of the commitments made in Paris by governments on a climate change that would result in a raise of temperature between 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade. So the IPCC did its work, and in South Korea the governments negotiated the policy statement of the IPCC. It's captured in this report, you can find it on the website. That report was forwarded to the governments when they met in Katowice in Poland for the climate change summit in Poland. Now, if you read the report and you read it careful, it's not good. It's not good what they predict. It's not good at all. So the report basically says, with some words, carefully, the commitments that you have made in Paris are not good enough. So unless you start immediately changing your behavior patterns, all your other economic development initiatives on transport, on energy or whatever, you will not be able to curb the climate change level below 2% centigrade. And that is what basically the report said. Now, there's many, many more details, and you'll get many more details. Now, the interesting thing is, this policy summary was negotiated by governments in South Korea. When the same governments came in Katowice, they refused to accept it. So, in Katowice, in the outcome of the climate change conference, you will read that they have asked their own scientific body to have another look at it next year. Because what came out of here was maybe too harsh. I don't know. So the debate this afternoon, I think, is a very interesting debate. You will have presentations on the expectations on climate change, on the implications for not only for the world, but I know that some of the presenters will target some countries like India and other countries and the Caspian Sea region. And in our discussion, I will basically challenge you to ask questions and to entertain with us the discussion on where do we go from here? What is true and what is not true, and where do we go from here? So, with this, let me just introduce then the first speaker to you. You will start off?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep.
So, you introduce yourself and you make your presentation. You have the floor.
Okay. Hello, everybody. My name is Leonard. I'm the president of Anglo-Eurasian, a consultancy company in Houston, Texas. Just as a brief background, I'm an oil wildcatter. I graduated from the University of Texas, spent 20 years with Amoco. I was their first manager in Russia. I was a vice president with Yukos, one of the founders of the Kuwait Energy Company. So when I talk about global warming and environmental problems, I'm not your average Californian avocado slicing, Zinfandel sipping, environmentalist, marijuana smoking hippie. I'm an oil wildcatter, and my last job as the chief executive officer of a New York Stock Exchange exploration company. After that, I've spent over a year in detailed research, hoping that the environmental situation really was not that bad, because it's not good news for the fossil fuel industry. And I've come to the conclusion that it really is that bad. And as an oil person, I'm hoping I have some credibility with the fossil fuel industry and trying to get them to understand the challenge that we face. What I'd like to do today is talk about the Caspian region, because not only is there a challenge that we have to face, but in the Caspian region there's actually something they can do about it that will help combat the global warming. So with that, let's move to the first slide. Can we move forward to the slide? Yeah.
Is it okay?
Yes, just a second.
The first slide. Yes.
Okay. Move forward to the first slide, please.
As this is PDF, we will not be able to change, but please tell me.
I will tell you. Yeah. Next slide, please. Okay. What I'd like to do in this presentation basically is make 4 points. The first point is that climate change is worldwide an accelerating problem, and it's potentially the greatest challenge of our time, of the 21st century. The second point I'll make is that the Caspian region is one of the most environmentally sensitive regions on the planet and is already feeling the effect of climate change. And if you want to see just how bad an environmental disaster can possibly be, all you have to do is look a little further to the east in what was once the Aral Sea. The third point I'd like to make is the most realistic path for the world in combating climate change right now is to shift to the use of natural gas as a bridge fuel while increasing the capacity of nuclear plus renewable energy sources. And the fourth point I'd like to make is that the countries of the Caspian region, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan, have the capacity to supply a significant portion of the needed supply of natural gas to replace coal in Eurasia's 3 largest gas markets: Europe, South Asia, really India, and China. So not only are we identifying the problem, but we also have a partial solution. So I'd like now to go to the first of the 4 points. Move forward to the next slide, please. The следующий slide, пожалуйста. In global warming, you've heard a lot about how the temperatures have increased by 1 degree centigrade in the world. And the 4 warmest years ever recorded, of course, are 2015, 16, 17, and 18. But the world is not warming uniformly. The land areas, the temperature increase is almost twice as fast, as the increase over the oceans. So as a result, we've almost reached the 2-degree temperature increase on land. So when people talk about, well, we should limit it to 2 degrees, well, we're already there as far as the land temperatures. The other point is that the temperatures in the polar areas, north of 60 degrees and south of 60 degrees south, have been warming twice as fast as the rest of the planet also. And that actually will have a very significant impact on climate. It already is starting. Следующем слайд, пожалуйста. No, back to the second slide. You've gone forward too far. Please go back. Go back to the second slide. Okay. Now the next slide, please.
This one?
No, the next slide. One. Yes. Okay, good. Stop. Okay. Between the years 1980 and 2016, 70% of the volume of ice during the summer months in the North Polar Cap have disappeared. And if that trend continues, by the middle of the century, during the summer months, there will be no ice cap in the North Pole. Now that has very significant implications for the climate in the Northern Hemisphere. The climate in the Northern Hemisphere is dominated by the jet stream, which is a band of air that separates the very cold air in the Arctic region from the warmer air in the temperate latitudes. And what's been happening as the difference in temperature between the polar areas and the temperate areas has been decreasing, the jet stream has started to get weaker and weaker, and it's starting to wobble. And what that means is that warm air from the temperate latitudes has been able to migrate into northern climates. So for example, you've gotten these heat waves in Scandinavia where you've had months at a time of temperatures that are greater than 30 degrees centigrade. But at the same time, you've gotten what they call in the United States polar vortex, where very cold temperatures have been able to break through to places such as New York. And what it's also done is started to disrupt the west to east flow of circulation and air. And where that hurts is that in the middle of continents, such as the middle of the United States or Central Asia, you depend on the flow of air from the west that takes air from the Pacific Ocean to the mid-continent US or the Atlantic Ocean to Central Asia to bring moisture. So what is happening is the circulation is beginning to weaken, which means that precipitation in the center of continents is going to start to decrease very specifically, very significantly. Next slide, please. So what's causing this? The prime cause is the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And the correlation between the increase of temperature and the increase of CO2 is very obvious. And you know, in the United States, we have some climate change skeptics, starting with our president. And people who can't see the correlation between those two factors, the only excuse I can give is, well, perhaps they don't know how to read graphs. But it's very obvious. Now, if you look at the slide on the lower left, it shows how much CO2 has been put in the atmosphere, and it shows that really 1950 was about the turning point when that amount started to go up. About 42% of the CO2 emissions come from coal, 34% come from oil, and 19% from natural gas. In terms of where it's coming from, until the 1970s and 80s, most of it was coming from the United States and the European Union. But those amounts hit a plateau and began to decrease in the EU in the 1980s, began to decrease in the United States in this century, and it's really been China, which now emits more CO2 than the United States and the EU combined. And they emit 28% of all the CO2 on the planet. Next slide, please. Now, I'm a geologist, and I tend to look at this perhaps in a different way, because I can see from the fossil record in the geologic past what the CO2 levels were. And the slide on your lower left, I think, is one of the most important slides with regard to climate change, because it tells what it was like in the past. And what it shows is that through most of geologic history, the CO2 in the atmosphere was somewhere around 800 to 900 parts per million. Then at the end of the Cretaceous, it dropped down, but in the Paleocene, it went back up to about 800 parts per million. Now, about 30 million years ago, it dropped from 800 parts per million down to about 400 parts per million. The climate cooled, and that's when the Antarctic ice shelf began to form. And it stayed at about 400 parts per million until about 2 or 3 million years ago, when it dropped down to the present level, and that's when the Arctic ice cap started to form. And it's been fluctuating between about 280 and 180 parts per million for the past 2 million years. It's been about 280 parts per million since about 12,000 years ago. And what's happened is, in the past 100 years, it's gone from 280 all the way to 410 parts per million. So in other words, we've gone up to a level that hasn't been seen for several million years. Now, it's increasing at the rate of 3 parts per million per year, which means by 2050, we're going to be at 500 parts per million. And by 2100, the end of this century, we're going to be over 600 parts per million. So we're going to be at levels that have not been seen since 30 million years ago. So this is not natural variation. This is basically man-made. Now, the chart on your lower right shows a number of different simulations in terms of what would happen in the future. The blue line at the low is if we stop using fossil fuels right now and got off it. And what that means is we could limit the temperature rise to about 2 degrees centigrade. Well, fossil fuels provide 85% of all the energy we use right now, and we're not just going to stop it. It just isn't going to happen, no matter how much you might want it. It would be economic catastrophe for the world. The gray line is what would happen if we basically followed the Paris Climate Accords. And that would raise the level to about 3.5 degrees centigrade eventually. And that would mean that your CO2 level would end up probably about 800 or 900 parts per million at the end. The scenario that I am trying to get people to accept is the gold one in the middle, which means we can try to cap the level of CO2 emissions where we are now, and gradually after 2060 start to drop them up. Yeah. What's important here is we've gone to a point where the Arctic ice cap is gone. We've just gone too far. It is going to be gone. What we need to do is try to stop climate change such that we don't get to the point where the Antarctic ice cap melts. And the reason for that is that 90% of the water on this planet above sea level is in the Antarctic ice cap. If that melts, that's when you get the catastrophic sea rise. So that's really the challenge for mankind. Next slide. From a geologic perspective, just to show the past, the last great warming was about 120,000 years ago when the Greenland ice caps rose and sea level went up to 7 to 10 meters above where it is now. By 2050, we're going to reach that level again, and after that, we'll start to go into the unknown history. So I'd like to move now to the Caspian. In the next slide, please. The temperature in the Caspian has increased by about 1.5 degrees since the 1950s. And the change in global circulation will likely cause a reduction in precipitation. Now, why is that important? Because the two key factors in the Caspian, as far as the sea level, it's balanced by the evaporation of the water and the amount of river runoff into the Caspian. The higher the temperature, the more the water evaporates, and the less precipitation, the more the water runs in. Now, the Caspian sea level, as mentioned, has gone up and down. In the last half of the 20th century, it dropped significantly. In the 1980s and 90s, it started to go up. But in the 20th century, it started to go down again due to this increased evaporation and reduced inflow. It's dropping at the rate of about 7 centimeters per year. And if that continues through this century, by the end of this century, the northern Caspian is going to be land area. It will be gone. And you'll be left with two smaller bodies of water in the central Caspian and the southern Caspian. There's a discussion before about the Caspian seals and the problem of ice in the north. Well, there's not going to be any ice because it's going to be all land. So, I mean, this is what is going to happen unless we significantly change the way we deal with climate change. There's no doubt about it. Next slide, please. The other potential disaster with regard to the Caspian nations is that there are two river systems, the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya River, which provide most of the water for the western parts of Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. And the green areas there show the irrigation of where you're producing food, producing export crops. Now, most of the water for those rivers come from melting of the glaciers in the Tian Shan, the other mountains. Since the 1950s, 30% of the volume of the water in those mountains has melted. By 2050, another 30% will melt. And by the end of this century, it'll all be gone. So the rivers of the Tian Shan, the Amu Darya and Sir Darya will be down to a trickle. And the water for that irrigation will be gone. So this will be a disaster for the regions of those three countries. Again, this is in the middle of happening. It's clear we can measure it. Unless there's dramatic results to change the present trends, this is what will happen. Next slide. Yeah. Just very briefly, different hydrocarbons produce different amounts of CO2. Coal produces something between 900 and 1,000 kilograms per equivalent barrel of crude. On the other end of the scale, natural gas is only 300 to 400 kilograms per CO2. So it's only 1/3 as much of a greenhouse gas as coal, which is of course extremely important. Next slide, please. So what's a realistic scenario to address global warming? I won't go through a lot of the details here. It's in my presentation, which will be on a website there. But basically, if you shift from coal to natural gas, you can at least get to a point where you can flatten out your emissions to a point where you're building up your renewable energy, such as solar and wind, so that within 20 or 30 years you can begin a real reduction in greenhouse gases. Next slide, please. So what does this look like? The slide on your, the lower slide there shows the CO2 emissions under this scenario. It's flattened out until about 2040, and then it begins to drop. So natural gas is actually a viable solution if you can use it to replace coal. Next slide, please. So here we come to the Caspian region. 75% of the world's natural gas reserves are found in 4 areas: Russia, the Middle East, North America, and the Caspian. The Caspian, compared to the other regions, produces a smaller amount of its reserves every year, and it has a larger amount that's available for export. But just as importantly, if you look at where the Caspian is situated, it's equidistant from the markets of China, India, and Europe. It's the one place that can actually supply all of the 3 regions. Next slide. The amount of gas that these regions will need, if you can eliminate the coal and replace half of it with natural gas and half of it with renewables, is something on the order of 300 billion cubic meters in South Asia, the same amount in China, and 100 billion cubic meters in Europe. This is a huge amount of gas. Next slide, please. The Caspian region actually has the capacity to triple its exports, and it could supply about 20% of the gas needed in each of these three regions. So this is entirely doable, and what it means is the Caspian region not only faces a terrible problem, but it actually has the capacity to partially solve the problem. So for the final slide, please. So again, to our 4 points, climate change is probably the most serious issue facing the world, and the longer we wait to address it, the more difficult the challenge will be. For the Caspian nations, the effect of climate change threatens their way of life and possibly even their very existence. A rapid transition to natural gas as a bridge fuel is a reasonable way to address it, and the abundant resources of the Caspian nation, combined with their central location, make them a possible solution to the problem. So really the next step could be a comprehensive plan, including the producing and consuming nations, the infrastructure and energy companies, to fully utilize the gas resources of the Caspian nation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ray. I invite you to have a look at his presentation because there's many more details, but we do not have the time to look at those details. He made, again, quite some challenging remarks that we can address in our discussion. He said we should not stop at 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade. As the government said in Paris, we should go up till 3 degrees centigrade because that is more realistic. And Caspian nations, please shift to natural gas. So it's quite challenging, 2 remarks. Governor, can I give you the floor?
Yeah.
And thank you for coming. You have the floor, sir.
Yeah. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So first of all, thank you very much for Caspian Week platform, for opportunity maybe to discuss the challenging topics around the Caspian region. So my colleagues been more focused on environmental aspects, so I would like to more focus on connectivity issues, especially because we have one is a name in the title of today's session is Belt and Road Initiative. And I think that Belt and Road Initiative is a very disputable aspect of the cooperation between regional and global superpowers. Now in Davos, everybody in discussion about trade wars between United States and China. So in these terms, I think would be interesting to talk how the Caspian region related to Belt and Road Initiative, which is good for Caspian region, which can be helpful and where is the risk. And I think we should, let's say, a little bit move to the background. So whom do you mean by the Caspian region and in broader terms? So everybody knows the Caspian neighborhood, so it's like a few countries which is surrounding Caspian Lake, which is Russia, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, Iran, and Kazakhstan. But in broader terms, I think we can talk about the Caspian neighborhood plus other Central Asian countries, which been showed in a previous presentation, including Uzbekistan, including Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. So these are like a community which mostly like former Soviet Union space, but plus Iran. And I think it's very much important to mention that still this geographic region, let's say, is very much been isolated, or because of the geographic destiny, be landlocked, not access to the, let's say, to the global seaports from one side, and from the other side, it was by different historical region, part of the different games around the between superpowers, and now all these countries got independence and start to build their own agenda. But at the same time, everyone realized that the own agenda is very much depends from how we really create this regional agenda, and I think it's very much important. Recent years, many countries in Central Asia and countries in Caspian neighborhood started to really very actively to talk to each other and to have this specific agenda focus on connectivity. So when we people criticize the Belt and Road Initiative, so there are few aspects of this which I wouldn't like to touch, including the geopolitical competition. But I think what the most important, what the world should and the Caspian region can learn from the idea of the Belt and Road, which, by the way, been first time announced in Astana 5 years ago. It is idea of connectivity. So we all remember this famous study of the McKinsey, which is shows that the economic gravity now moving from the previous 500 years position to the new one, which means from Euro-Atlantic area more towards Asian dimension. So in fact, there are a few forecasts that up to the 2050, number one economy would be China, number two economy would be India, and so that's kind of the really disruptive, let's say, approach to the view which we, let's say, the way how the Western perception last 200 years. And this is like a reality, so which we should learn from one side. From the other side, we understand that the Asia is not like European continent or European Union is very much well connected to each other, so there is no issues of the connectivity, so all of these, let's say, connectivity issues been resolved last 300 years probably, but for Asia is key issues, especially in infrastructure development. So connectivity, so some of the critics can say like it's a China-centric connectivity or whatever, but the China has the biggest, let's say, landmass in one of the biggest landmass in Asian region, and Central Asia being like recognized part of which is located between EU and China, also can benefit from this recent development when the Asia and China talking about connectivity in Asian Pacific region, but also in the other part of Asia. And from the other side, we see that it definitely would be big opportunities to connect by the land bridge the two big economies, where I'm talking about the Chinese and European economies. So these are all interesting agenda, and I think the Kazakhstan is very much being committed to, first of all, to create on very good neighborhood, and you probably know that recently in the Caspian neighborhood agreed about the common values and about common approaches how to develop the Caspian region. So it was a meeting of 5 leaders in seaport Aktau in Kazakhstan, and also been recently, last year, been meeting between Central Asia leaders. So we all realize that in the region that it should be more, let's say, closer dialogue in order how to develop infrastructure. So let me give you some small examples what was done by Kazakhstan in the recent 5 years, and you will see so how dramatically situation was changed. So if you remember in the Soviet Union time, so all the, let's say, railways, roads led from the south of Kazakhstan more to the north of Kazakhstan, or led to Moscow, like in Roman Empire, all the roads led to Rome. So, and Kazakhstan is has a very vast geography. So the territory of Kazakhstan is like, for Americans, it's like 4 size of Texas state. For Europeans, it's like an entire Western European territory. So our border with Russia is bigger than border between United States and Canada. You can imagine so how huge the connectivity issues for Kazakhstan. So if you fly from the western part of Kazakhstan till eastern part of Kazakhstan, it will take you 4 hours by plane. So that's why it was very important for Kazakhstan to connect, let's say, not only south and north, but also to connect east and west. And at the same time, when we connect eastern part of Kazakhstan with the western part of Kazakhstan, it's automatically also connect border with China with 3 main dimensions. One is a border with the Russian Federation, one is through seaport Aktau, through transit in the Caspian Lake till a seaport in Baku, and then Azerbaijan, Georgia, Turkey, Eastern European markets, through Russia till Western European markets, and then recently been built railways which is connect border with China, with the border with Turkmenistan, and through Turkmenistan with Iran. So these are like a 3 diversified routes which is very much important for Kazakhstan, not to depend from any type of routes, but to be diversified in many dimensions. This is just about the physical infrastructure, about roads and railways. So my colleagues knows very well what was developed in terms of the oil and gas pipeline. So exactly been the biggest the biggest gas pipeline being built from Turkmenistan till through Kazakhstan to China, which is 8,000 kilometers. So I think this is also resolve somehow issues of the energy security of China, just bringing so significant amount of Turkmenian gas. The countries in the region also benefit from this, using some of the access to this gas pipeline. Kazakhstan also recently started to build the a gas pipeline towards Chinese border, but also to build the gas pipeline which is connect western part of Kazakhstan till the center in north part of Kazakhstan. So one of the key projects which we were working this year is the gasification of the city of Astana. So it's one of the, let's say, green one of the green bonds which going to be issued by the national companies would be specifically focused like a green bonds. So I already mentioned about infrastructure of the oil and gas pipeline, and I know that the recent discussion is also after all this agreement in the Caspian Sea, also how to connect Turkmenistan gas towards the European direction. So I think it also would be so big changes in terms of using regional gas resources. So you see the region is very much important for the rest of the world. We are from one side supplier to EU. If you ask me what is the structure of the trade of Kazakhstan, so 50% of trade of Kazakhstan is European Union, 20% Russia, and 20% China. So I'm sure that before I told you, so your perception is completely different. Yeah. So that's why all the countries are very much focused on the cooperation with European Union from one side, but have their own agenda because we are part of the also Eurasian Economic Union, which is a significant 70% of the former Soviet Union territory. So I think, so in these terms, so back to the Belt and Road Initiative, I think continuation this agenda of to connect not only Kazakhstan but countries in the region between each other, the region itself towards the let's say the growing Chinese Indian economy, towards the GCC region, connect better Europe and China, but using this, benefiting from this in the region is very much important for the economic development, and economic development is very much important in terms of the, let's say, sustainable growth in the future. So in these terms, the green economy agenda is very also powerful in Kazakhstan. You know that last year the Kazakhstan hosted the Global Fair Expo 2017, which is focused on the future energy. So the idea was also to bring to the region best practice of the best green technologies, which is really can help us to diversify energy consumptions towards alternative sources like solar and wind. So we study all the experience, more than 160 countries, and trying to use the latest edition technologies in our day-to-day life. So we host this expo. One of the, let's say, legacy of expo been creating the specific strategy for regional green development in Central Asia, which was developed by Astana International Financial Center and European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So we now decided that the AIFC would be the regional champion for development of the green agenda. So, and we specifically have a special vehicle which we called Green Finance Center. So everybody talking about the green technologies, but when we started to talk about the concrete execution of the particular project, the key problems is the financing is usually. So that's why we start to study the best experience. So like we've seen what was done in Luxembourg, like to be the green finance hub for the Europe. And it's also important for us to have this knowledge how to really, let's say, stimulate the financial institutions. And I think here I have to mention that very important work was done by the Chinese authorities. So in fact, the when the Chinese authorities agreed to sign up Paris Agreement, it was a game changer for the rest of the world. And I think that was done because of the responsibility of the Chinese authorities. From one side, global responsibility, let's say, and from the other side, it's a huge internal challenge inside the China, when the pollution and environment is a key, let's say, problems for the Chinese population. And I think that's why China is very much focused on this. I'm sure you know about the success of China in terms of the solar and wind energy, and also the nuclear energy. And by the way, Kazakhstan, one of the biggest supplier of the raw materials, fuel in uranium towards China. This is also part of our global responsibility. But also it's very much important how they use the regulation in financial area in order to stimulate banks and to stimulate investment funds to invest to the green economy agenda. And I think that this experience we also would like to, let's say, to study and distribute among the Central Asia region, broader terms, Caspian region, because this is all our key challenge. The other important dimension is that, so how to build infrastructure. So how to, let's say, be in the principles of the sustainable development. So how to build infrastructure being fully focused on the KPIs on sustainability. And I think here is also very much important, and I think it should not be just like propaganda or counter-propaganda, which we now see on a global level, but it should be very pragmatic and specific work together with the Chinese authorities, but also the China try to bring the agenda of sustainability and Belt and Road under the international umbrella. And you know that specific institution been created like Asian Investment Infrastructure Bank, AIIB, which is also like analog of the ADB or EBRD within World Bank, focus on the investment project in Asia. From the other side, many Chinese institutions like Silk Road Fund and like Chinese Development Bank is also very much focused. So how to help to the local authorities in the region to finance particularly very much important project. But we all know that the problem is that it should be very disciplined debt policy, should not be like any, let's say, negative scenario like it was happened in some countries. So in these terms, this is responsibility of the national on national level, but it's also can be discussed on regional level. So let me stop here. So I would like just to stimulate discussion about Belt and Road, and just to say that for our part of the world, especially for Central Asian countries and for Caspian region in broader terms, this is not something completely new or disruptive. This is just historical way back to agenda of restoring ancient Silk Road, which have been very famous between 8th and 15th century, and it was like the biggest custom union those time globally. Those time Central Asia between 8th and 12th century been even global financial center. So I would like to finalize my speech by the famous rephrase of slogan of let's make Silk Road great again.
Thank you very much, Governor, also with your optimistic view and your very constructive intervention about, we know from the United Nations that Kazakhstan has been spearheading a bridging discussion on the green economy between East and West. You have started that many years ago. It is now yielding fruit, and we have been part of that, and I think it is a very important discussion, starting with the notion that integrating environmental externalities in your development planning will not cost you, but in the long run benefit you. And that is exactly the message that has gone out from this initiatives, and I really think that is a good initiative also. Let me now turn our colleague from China. Please, you have the floor, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Xiankun Lu. Thanks. No, my life is very simple. I mean, I was for 21 years senior Chinese trade diplomat, and actually quite a lot of my trade career was related to Central Asia and the Caspian area. I was a leading negotiator for the accession of Kazakhstan and others, Tajikistan and also Russia, when they tried to join the World Trade Organization. Ambassador at Geneva, who was here yesterday, actually was my counterpart during the accession negotiation for Kazakhstan. So thanks to Caspian Week to invite me, so I could get reconnected to my old friends. But right now I'm very humble, how to say, kind of professor, and also a think tank managing director. Ledeco in Geneva is a small think tank we established a few years ago to help international organizations, international companies, business associations, universities and enterprises on kind of policy advice, mostly focusing on trade, but also on education and training programs, also focusing on trade and investment aspects. After listening to the two previous speakers, my job is very simple now. I mean, I could, as a Chinese, I could probably humbly contribute, focusing on the theme of this panel, talking about the China Belt and Road Initiative as related to investment, infrastructure, energy, and what is happening, what is potential impact on global climate change, and what is missing or not done perfectly, and what should be the potential solution. So let me start by saying that, of course, we all know that simply looking at infrastructure, we know both at the regional and the global level, there's a big gap. I mean, if you look at carefully the Asian Development Bank statistics, each year we are talking about purely in Asia area a need for infrastructure investment between 1.3 to 1.7 trillion US dollars. And right now, the global players like World Bank and ADB and others could only supply 1/3 of that. And that's by 2030. If we go beyond that, looking at 2040, we're looking at global level, something like a kind of global need for infrastructure of 17 trillion US dollars. So where would that come from? Of course, China Belt and Road Initiative comes in as a complementary initiative to help on that. Of course, the initiative is much broader, covers a lot of things, but infrastructure is there. If you look at very carefully, the Vision Action Plan by a few ministries of China issued in 2016. Infrastructure and the enhancement of connectivity is one key element of China's Belt and Road Initiative. I think that of course will add up to the global efforts to build infrastructure along Belt and Road Initiative, but also globally. We know what infrastructure could play. I mean, very importantly, they bring your products much closer to your consumers, and they bring the passengers, which you need 3 or 7 days, maybe from North Kazakhstan to South Kazakhstan. But with the high-speed train, it will be within hours. We are witnessing some good examples on that. But coming back to the association with climate change, there are two parts here. The first one, as Ray and Kairat has shared, that one part of the infrastructure projects are actually directly contributing to climate change alleviation. You talked about the pipes for natural gas, which will replace coal, and that is happening now in China with this natural gas pipe between Turkmenistan and China, and I think that's very encouraging. Also, we have some other projects for water conservation and also solar panel power stations. Those are good ones. But on the other hand, we also know that infrastructure has a scale, are usually big, and then normally they will add to, if not well managed, will add more to footprints and also contribute to more carbon contributions. And the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative itself is such a kind of global initiative, covers more than 66 countries. So itself is also something which potentially could have a big impact on the climate change. So that's where we need to be careful. I think we need to see how we could greenize the Belt and Road Initiative. Of course, looking at China, China up to now is not a perfect example as kind of something green or something that will be a pure contributor to climate change. Because China itself, as Ray has said, that is the major contributor, 28% of the global carbon emission. But that's, of course, what we are looking at the, how to say, the latest figures. If we're going back to a historical stock, we would know that before 1995, 95% of carbon emission comes from developed country. And then before 2005, 85% from developed country, and which of course accounts only 20% of global population. So we need to look at carefully about the general picture. The second thing that China is development itself has been gone through a kind of difficult process. We did some pollution back at home, looking at the fog in Beijing, traffic jam everywhere, pollution in rivers. That's here, and that's why the new leadership have been taking some actions to correct that. So to make it simple, China did give rise to some concerns about, well, if China would repeat the same mistake they have done at home. Things are changing. Chinese new leadership has declared that President Xi Jinping has taken ecological civilization as one of the top 4 items on his political agenda, and China also have been, as Kairat has said, that has stayed with the Paris Agreement when other players are retreating, and China also has declared politically that they are going to make efforts to make a Belt and Road Initiative green. So things are happening there. But of course, Chinese enterprises, being some kind of new global investor, are not well equipped with a mature concept, a nice communication strategy on sustainability and climate change. So there's something missing here. But of course, we cannot simply stop doing anything simply because there's a problem. In China, we used to say that it's like, if you do that, it's like that you're afraid of being choked and then you stop eating. That won't help. So we need to develop more infrastructure projects. We need to we just need to do it better. How to do it? I mean, what is missing there? I think for me, the first thing is that China should take the leadership because it's China's own initiative. And what we are seeing is that things are happening there. A few ministries of China have tabled various action plans, policy guidelines on infrastructure, investment, financing by all kinds of Chinese ministries. So those are there. Of course, those are just guidelines, something not yet with a teeth. So in China, we are also talking about, and WEF has proposed that, maybe to add some teeth into those guidelines. As one thing Davos WEF has proposed is that maybe to ask Chinese, at least state-owned enterprises and public listed companies, when they disclose their annual performance report, one element should be indispensable about regarding their overseas investment along Belt and Road Initiative. How are they doing about sustainability and environmental protection? So those are things that needs to be done. I think that's, of course, good. The second point, I think, which needs to be there, the collaboration with the recipient countries along Belt and Road Initiative. There are a lot of things happening, including with Kazakhstan, that bilateral MOUs, cooperation programs, sustainability is always an element there. I think the local countries, on top of that, should also maybe develop more and enforce more the kind of local regulations and laws on environmental protection and sustainability. And that will help greenize Chinese Belt and Road Initiative more. And third element, I think it would be indispensable, the collaboration with international organizations. because those are the organizations with nice concept and with good strategy and everything that could help China to greenize, and also recipient countries to greenize projects along the Belt and Road Initiative. We have seen good initiatives from both UNDP, World Bank, and others. If you look at carefully, actually, the first 3 projects by China, China-led the AIIB, Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. The first 3 major infrastructure projects were mostly in the Caspian area, including Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. So, and also the key element in those projects in approving them is actually about whether they are taking good actions to control the potential impact on environmental protection. The fourth element which I would say is that the role of non-governmental organizations, because this is an indispensable element of any kind of good management strategy by governments. NGOs, WWF, Paulson Institute, and many others are actually engaging a lot of Chinese governments, Chinese state-owned enterprises, and also recipient countries, trying to develop a strategy. I was part of that process. We developed one strategy, we call it Greenize China Supply Chain along One Belt and One Road Initiative. Some of our proposals are already being translated in China's government action plans. So I see that Caspian Week has just established this foundation, and also we see that we have this Tehran Convention, and hopefully you could also be part of that process in the future. And the fifth point would be enterprises. We all know that infrastructure is big and demands a lot of financing. So we know that private investment should be an indispensable element there. So that's why we developed this PPP kind of concept. And then there are many things happening there with this. So enterprises and their direct investment, their participation in PPP projects would all need them to develop kind of really good strategy on climate change. Chinese enterprises are still learning, but a lot of things are happening more than just Chinese themselves. China has developed this so-called trilateral cooperation. So it's like a Chinese company, a Swiss company, like ABB are doing a lot with Chinese and to bid for a project in recipient countries. And that's where the foreign companies are contributing with a better strategy there. The last point I would like to say is, of course, we as individuals, as people, we are also part of that process, such as what we are trying to discuss here. To conclude my intervention, the last point I would say is that as China has declared, a Belt and Road Initiative geographically covers only 66 countries. But it is an open initiative to include anyone, any country, any private sector, any organization who want to be part of that process. So that's why actually if you look at the first summit on Belt and Road Initiative 2 years ago in Beijing, there were actually more than 140 countries, 80 international organizations who were there. So it's beyond this 66, and 103 among all these countries and organizations have signed concrete MOUs or projects with China. So I mean, the next summit is going to take place in April in Beijing again. So I would hope that I will see many of you there. I hope I will be there too. And as Kairat has said, that it's a common responsibility. So let's work together for the green future of ourselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Just one remark to you, and then we go to the next speaker, is that I am an old man, and throughout my life, China has presented it too much as a developing country which is learning. I'm very happy that you said that China now should change and become a leading country that is teaching. So I think that would be a very good type of element. That, by the way, is also, as you know, a cultural issue. But I think it is very important that you said that. And so let us turn to our last speaker, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Can I have my slide? Oh, yes.
I will.
As last speakers, I am Marco Gaia, the head of the regional center south of MeteoSwiss, the National Weather Service of Switzerland. I have a degree in atmospheric physics. I am a meteorologist. And, well, I agree with what you have already said. Therefore, it's difficult as last speaker to say something new, but I think something I missed in your presentation. It is the time dimension. And I will show you why. The next slide, please. Well, time dimension. Start with two pictures of Davos. Left picture, Davos a century ago. The time of my grandmother, you see there? The time of your grandparents. Right? Davos, more or less today. The time of my daughter and the time of your children, I suppose. 100 years difference. I suppose that everybody agree that we have had a huge development in our society. Perhaps not in all the countries of the world, but in the major countries of the world, in this century, we have had a big development of the economy, of the society. And now the challenge is that every country in the world can have the same development. To achieve this development, we need energy, a lot of energy. And the major part of the energy used in the last 100 years was energy coming from the fossil fuels, coal, gas, oil. And this has a fee. This has a cost. Please, next slide. You see, these graphs, these diagrams, shows the development of the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. In the same time period, in the same few generations between your grandparents and your children, the mankind has increased the concentration of CO2 to a level that historical is really new. And the point is that CO2 stay for century in the atmosphere, and second, has an impact in different natural fluxes in the atmosphere, especially in the energy fluxes. More, the CO2 can make the ocean more and more acid because the ocean absorbs CO2. And therefore, this vital ecosystem is changed by CO2. Next, please, next slide. Increasing CO2 concentration in the atmosphere means a big change in the energy fluxes in the atmosphere. The consequence, the first consequence, not there are different, but the first is an increase in the temperature. And here you see a lot of small Switzerland. The first left is the Switzerland in 1864. We started more than 150 years ago the measure in Switzerland. And you see, with the reference to the period 1961-1990, blue is cooler, red is warmer. That's the reference. And each year in the last 30 years was really a warmer year. This is an example of Switzerland, but you can produce similar maps for more or less all the region on the world. We are living in a warmer world. Next, please. If you change the temperature, you give more energy to the atmosphere, and there are a lot of possible consequences. For example, in Switzerland, we can, without doubt, say the climate has already changed. We have less snow days, and this is a problem for a country like Switzerland. Okay, this winter we have a lot of snow, but it's not always the situation in the last years. We have an increase in the temperature with, for example, heat waves that have an impact on the public health costs, for example. We have an increasing in the height of the 0 degrees line. It means for the glacier in Switzerland, as in a lot of other mountain regions in the world, that glaciers are melting. We are more and more intense shower and precipitation. Next, please. The science. Could you? Voila, thank you. The science behind this consequence, it's clear. It's now a sound science knowledge. We know why. And we are able to forecast the future. We are able to say what will happen if we continue, for example, as business as usual in the emission of CO2 concentration as we have done in the last years. We are able to simulate the climate of the future. And this is a picture of 4 consequences calculated last fall with these new scenarios, climate scenarios for Switzerland. And we expect, for example, in Switzerland, during the summer months in the future, less and less precipitation, with a lot of consequence on the agricultural, on the energy production by hydropower, and so on. We expect more and more tropical night, with consequence on the use of the electrical energy, for example, with consequence on the public health, and so on. Less and less snow day in the mountain, with consequence on the tourist. The problem is not that we are changing the meteorological boundary, but that the meteorological boundary change or have an impact on our environment, and this impact on our environment has an impact on our society. That is the major problem. What is experience our societies? Please, next. With our calculation, we are able to show that if we don't change how energy is produced and used in our society, the increase in the temperature, and therefore all the consequence on our climate system will have a really big impact. This is this reddish zone. If we start to change how we produce and use energy, for example, using gas, we can decrease this increase of temperature, and therefore try to be more or less in the target of the Paris Agreement. But we need really to change how we use and we produce the energy. Next, please. And there is a simple relation at the end. CO2, once is in the atmosphere, stay in the atmosphere. It's very, very stable. CO2 stay for centuries in the atmosphere. Therefore, we can easily calculate that if we increase the total amount of CO2, it's more or less linear in the first approximation that we increase the temperature, and then we increase all the consequence on the environment. We are now more or less here. We have compared to pre-industrial time, already have a global 1 degrees increase of temperature. If we won't stay in the Paris Agreement, is here the global budget of carbon that stay at our disposal. It's not a lot. The major part we have already emitted in the atmosphere. And this is the problem. It's clear we can decide not to follow the Paris Agreement, and then we have a higher global budget, but then we should accept the consequence on our environment. Next, please. This is my last slide. This picture was taken 40 years ago. It was the first time that the man, it was the Apollo 8 crew around the moon, has seen an Earth rise. The rise of this beautiful planet that we call Earth is our planet. We just have one planet. We don't have a B planet. And therefore, we should try to do all the action possible in order to enable, as I said at the beginning of my presentation, all the countries to develop in a manner as done for the developing countries, for the European countries in the last 100 years. But if we don't act now, because we don't have any more time to wait, if we don't act, the challenge will be more and more difficult, because we are really changing the climate of our planet. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, with your permission, we have a lot of food for thought and talk and discussion. And so, not only on climate change, but also on the connectivity issues that were highlighted by the two speakers from Kazakhstan and China, and on the climate agenda. So you can either ask questions or make comments as you wish, and I will ask the panel to reply. So I open the floor. So, don't be shy. Here.
It's crystal clear. No more discussion.
Yes, please. Can you give the person the phone? Thank you. And please briefly introduce yourself and make the comment.
I'm Leonard, advisor to the Prime Minister of Tatarstan Republic. And now I would like to ask Mr. Kairat Kelimbetov regarding the Astana International Financial Center. How AIFC could facilitate whatever economic relationship within the Caspian region, and what was the main idea for establishing this institution? Could you elaborate on that? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for this opportunity. I think, so we already mentioned that now it's like a global competition for investment everywhere. So everybody wants to bring global or regional investment to develop their own economy. But usually the kind of the global investors community, they're not considered it's easier to get acceptance to invest to some certain country if there is a let's say, if it's scalable, let's say, if there is a market bigger than just market of one country. So I think in these terms, Central Asia or Caspian region in broader terms is a unique group of countries with a market like 50, 60 million people. In the future, it will be 100 million people up to the 2030, according to the recent researches. And I think that it's very much important to let the rest of the world know what is this region about. And I think is more we will have engines like AIFC, and I'm not talking that it's like a monopoly of Kazakhstan, but the AIFC, I think creation of the idea of AIFC is not just focused to bring investment to Kazakhstan. This is one of the definitely key tasks, but also through AIFC to bring it to the region. So we see the future of, let's say, the better future of the region if we will unite our attempts to bring investors. So, and in these terms, you know that it should be very professional dialogue. So now investors globally knows where is the situation is better, where the markets are very promising, where the rules are predictable, where is there any rules of law ecosystem in the region or no. And I think that we are starting to build the first based on rule of law ecosystem, which is, let's say, world-class in terms of the different solutions like dispute resolution authorities, independent financial court, international arbitration center from one side, world-class capital markets platform based on the new stock exchange, on the new technology, but also ecosystem for the talented pool of the young generation, let's say. So the idea is to allow all of them to provide the ideas or to learn new technologies, and based on this knowledge to create, let's say, additional applications or whatever. And in these terms, it's like a regional hub or hub for, let's say, future development of the region. In these terms, it's like clusters of smart ideas and smart initiatives and smart people. And we do believe that the role of AIFC would be crucial in these terms. But again, if you allow me to remind you the ancient Silk Road. The Silk Road conception was like a trade of silk between China and the rest of the world. And it was like, let's say, executed by special expeditions, like by, let's say, based on what we learn from history, like camels or whatever. And that's the key point was like security. I mean, it was like physical security. And as more trade hubs being on the way, as more secure was the situation. So the same now, I think that as more global smart cities, different hubs would be in the region, is more bigger would be pie which we can get from the rest of the world.
Thank you. Can I ask you, I also give the opportunity, of course, to the panelists to comment on each other's interventions if they want to. I know that you would like to say something about one of the other interventions. Is that correct?
Well, just a summary of the presentations. Yeah, I would.
Yes,
wouldn't
so
mind.
Then go ahead.
Oh, okay, yeah.
You have a microphone. And
Okay, no, I'd like to mention something that really covers all three of the presentations, and I'd really like to start with the last one in talking about the speed at which climate change is progressing. And there's no magic point of turning a switch. If we do it by this time, it'll be disaster, or it won't. It's getting worse and worse each year, and the longer you wait to address it, the harder it will be, and the less effective the results will be. I heard somebody yesterday say, well, in 12 years the planet will be a disaster, so I've got to do something in the next 12. No, it's just going to gradually get worse and worse, and the longer it waits to address it. And I think the real answer is it will have to get bad enough that the world will sit down and say, we have to take effective measures. Which brings me to the second point. The Paris Climate Accord is a well-meaning but completely ineffective document. And that's just the sad truth. If you take a look at the specific pledges, if countries fulfill the pledges, we're going to have a 3-degree rise in the climate. So this business about let's keep it to 2 degrees, it's just a political statement, and it's not reality. I mean, for example, the Chinese pledge is to limit their CO2 emissions to a 60% increase from a base of 2010 to 2030. The good thing is they acknowledge that climate change is a problem, but they're not cutting their emissions. It's the same with Russia. India's acknowledgement they're going to allow themselves to increase their CO2 emissions by 200% by 2030. So and there's no enforcement mechanism. So it's a well-meaning statement that is that's not effective. There are some countries that have set ambitious goals. I was delighted to hear, for example, that in Kazakhstan, Astana is going to switch from coal-fired generation to gas-fired generation. These are the kind of steps that have to be taken in a massive scale. The last piece that I will mention, it's a hard thing to mention, but it needs to be mentioned. With China, they've done some very good things, and they've also done some very bad things. The good things, they are now the #1 producer in the world of electric vehicles, which is what has to happen in the future. They also very early saw that natural gas was going to be a way for the future, and they built a natural gas grid throughout the country, including the East-West pipeline that takes gas from Central Asia. The bad thing is they built their industrial revolution on coal. And not only did they build it in China, but the Belt and Road Initiative, while it has many good aspects, China is financing 70% of the world's new power plants around the world, everywhere from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Turkey, Vietnam, Angola, Kenya. They need to stop financing coal-fired power plants around the rest of the world, because that's one of the biggest problems that we have right now. So again, China's doing several very good things, but they're also doing several very bad things. And there needs to be, because they do things on such a large scale, that they're the ones that matter more than anybody else.
Thank you very much. Yes, you have the floor. Can somebody bring a microphone? And please also briefly introduce yourself.
Yes, Laurent Horvat from the state of Geneva. I have a question. Today arrived from Norway a young lady, 15 years old, Thunda Grender. She's in Davos, and she's pushing the young people to do something for the climate. Do you think that, what is the position of the young generation? They can do something because it was done by us, the old generation. What can they do? And how will you embrace or not their point of view?
She was in Katowice, making the same speech to the governments that had to take decisions there. And as I just informed you, the decisions were not very progressive. The decisions were really very conservative that the governments took in Katowice. And I know that she was not pleased. But this comes back to the question of the speed that my colleagues are talking about. I think, well, in the concluding debate, I think one of the main issues is that governments should, and even the private sector and science should, also with greater speed look at adaptation and mitigation measures. Because I think we have to, one way or another, accept that climate change is going to be with us for quite some time because of the interests of countries, and so that there is a need to also more in depth discuss how we can cope with it and what we can do to protect ourselves against it. I told you that I come from a country, myself, the Netherlands, which is now entertaining a debate, asking itself what to do if there is a 6-meter sea level rise. The joke is that we make plans to conquer Germany. we will invade Germany, and so I promise you that these plans are there to do exactly that. But this is a joke, but basically that goes for many coastal communities in the world. It is like that, and I think those communities also should put more pressure on the national governments to inform them and to talk to them. I talk to Indian colleagues who are dependent for a large extent on the water sources in the Himalaya. You know, we don't know what's going to happen if those sources dry up. It's not going to be good. But I mean, slowly it is happening. So apart from political decisions, I think, and that is where technology can do a lot and can help a lot in terms of mitigation and adaptation. And in the Caspian Sea region, they have some experience with sea level water fluctuation, especially in the area of coastal zone management. I mean, they had to adapt to sea level changes in the past ages that were unforeseen and at that time unexplained. And my colleague from Kazakhstan can confirm. The debate is still not entirely conclusive on what is really the cause of the sea level fluctuation in the Caspian Sea region. But it was so you wanted to, please, you have the floor.
Yeah, no, I just want to quickly make two comments. First, on this excellent question about how to engage young generations for this, because as you said, more or less now you are seeing someone at our age or above our age who are being active. But actually, if you look carefully beneath the big waves as we have been creating, you will see some young ones actually actively in participating. I mean, I could always use the example of China. I mean, for both Copenhagen and Paris, the big conference there, actually, I mean, through non-governmental organizations, think tanks, we have mobilized, not on behalf of China, I mean, just as private players, young ones to be there to witness what is happening and what is not being done and what should be done. So, and after that, they have been really devoting themselves into this. One of my students, actually, I'm a professor half-time, actually, he's an excellent English speaker, top player in the class, and well-trained. And before I show him the big picture, her dream was to go to US, Stanford or somewhere, to become an investor and go to Wall Street to make big money. And after that, just 2 weeks ago, she sent applications, not anymore about investment. She sent about 7 applications to European and American universities to focus on public policy. And she's accepted by almost all of them, including Chicago and Georgetown universities. And she told me that her future job is to come to work in either NGO or international organizations on global trade, climate change, all those things. So that's what we are happening. So for me, education is an indispensable part of that engagement for young generations. And of course, that's what we, as Ledeco, what we are doing with universities. The second point, maybe a comment on what has been said by the panelists. The first thing is about the time dimension. I'm very much in agreement with Marco that this becomes really an issue. We are talking about what is happening, what we are doing, and he pointed out the thing, something we didn't say, that we're not doing enough because we don't have the time. Actually, one of my personal experiences that my wife, we live in Geneva, so we just bought a house, and because last year was the hottest year, we have been living here for more than 10 years, the hottest year in Switzerland. So my wife was seriously considering to install air conditioner in our house, and which of course is not allowed in Geneva. I'm happy about that. I'm all the sympathy with my wife, but I'm happy with the Geneva, regulation. So we have a serious time issue, and also as Ray has said, Paris Agreement and many other things are not enough. But I would be cautious to say that those are not needed. We're looking at not only the Paris Agreement, we're looking at a whole global governance structure, which all of them are trying to contribute. UNEP, Paris Agreement, FCCC, and many others are trying to do this. Because of geopolitical things and the bargaining among governments, the agreed thing is not enough. But it is better than nothing. Because without that, as you said, people are only going to do bad things, no good things. And there's no constraint. And if you simply take a retreat, like Trump administration has done, out of this, like I said, you stop eating because you are afraid of being choked. And those are not good ones, but that's the first step in a hopefully not a long process, let's say.
Hopefully.
So and even the WTO World Trade Organization, which with which I'm mostly associated with, is that it's also trying to help. In 2013, here in Davos, WTO, some members, including US, China, EU, others, have launched initiative to negotiate under WTO what is called environmental goods agreement. So which means that the WTO could help bring down the tariffs on all those pipes, solar panels, all these products which would contribute to the mitigation of climate change to zero. And then this will be much easier spread all over the world. And that would help directly about climate change mitigation. Of course, since 2013, many things, negotiations have happened, but right now it's in freezer. Why? For many reasons, including also the disengagement of Trump administration, for me, which is a mistake. So let's try to look at what is bad about global governance on climate change. But look at what is not enough, but let's conserve it and build up on it instead of retreating from it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's clear we cannot solve the problem here, but we can take the information home. And what is more, you still want to have an intervention? Yes, no question, please go ahead.
Sorry, my name is Karin Legler. I'm from Locarno.
Can you give her a microphone, please?
A microphone for the lady.
Yes, thank you. My name is Karin Legler. We are from Locarno, and we would like to know from you. We have a company based in Switzerland, and we have a good solution for this. We produce CO2-free products for infrastructure. We are always in Africa, in the US, and in Middle East, and what we like to know is how you go into this project, and when someone is coming and says we have a good solution, how is the way?
What project are you talking about, please?
Infrastructure, building smart cities. We are doing all this.
If you have a solution, maybe you
Yes,
have
we have.
maybe you have a bilateral discussion on this issue.
Yeah.
Yeah, is that okay?
Okay.
Governor, or you want to?
Yeah, I just would like to add. I mean, definitely let's talk after the session. Yeah. But I think the two also key trends didn't mention, so probably we shouldn't mention everything. But the two aspects I think very crucial. So first is access to the new technologies. I'm sure that, for example, the US withdrew themselves from Paris Agreement, but it doesn't mean that they stop to invest to green technologies. They are global leaders in green technologies. They know what to do and how to do. The problem is for emerging markets is it affordable price for all of these, let's say, solution technologies, and it's a key question. I think that let's say, many countries continue based on the coal-fired power station, not because they are stupid and lazy, but because it's like a commercial viability to, let's say, to change the model is very, let's say, is very complicated. So that's why. So all of these issues around access to the natural gas, access, and it's always this discussion between, let's say, US, EU, and Russia, let's say, access of oil and gas to China. So this is not easy, or even you mentioned this water supply. So we have in the region countries which is water suppliers and countries which is more water users. And I think I agree with my Chinese colleagues that who mentioned is we need like a real workable global and regional governance, which is allow us to resolve these issues. There is no time anymore to, let's say, to delay this problem. So should be access to the new technologies, but we also one important stuff is what been mentioned by the young generation, let's say, mind is also very much important. Now we start to all the generation globally start to change their mind because of the new business model. For example, like car sharing, let's say, or the people move more to bikes, let's say. So in the 60s, the people doesn't like that the China more use bikes. Now everybody would be appreciated for China if they back to the practice on 60s, let's say. And so these are kind of the global changes which we, I think, should learn. And so the idea probably of such forums or such offline station like AIFC to bring this best practice and to help to many particular cities or particular areas to leapfrog, I think. So in these terms, we are happy to learn latest development of the smart cities. So thank you very much for your question. Yeah.
I basically think this is a good concluding intervention, because one of the issues that I want to bring to your attention is that And specifically, when you talk about global governance, on the governance issue, there is another forum here which should listen to us. And so, I mean, Governor, I challenge you, there is another forum. For a colleague from China, there's another forum of leaders who are more powerful than we are in what we are saying. So our concluding remark might be that I suggest we take the information home, and those of you who have access to the leadership in the other forum might bring some messages from this discussion to them. And maybe Davos can be launching such a thought. That's what might be an issue. And maybe it's too ambitious, but I can do that. Can I, on your behalf, thank the speakers very much for their interventions, and you for listening to them, and for a very good debate we had. Thank you very much.